The air in the Gilded Cage was a carefully crafted cocktail of secrets and sin, aged whiskey and expensive perfume. Low, golden light bled from shaded Art Deco lamps, glinting off the polished mahogany of the bar and the crystal glasses held in hands that signed million-dollar deals by day and sealed darker bargains by night. In the corner, a lone saxophonist painted the smoky room with a melody that was pure, melancholic soul, a sound too honest for a place built on beautiful lies. From her perch behind the bar, Nora Hayes, to the few who earned the privilege, was the conductor of this nightly symphony. At 24, she moved with an economy of grace that belied her years. Her dark auburn hair was pinned back in a simple, elegant twist, and a forest green dress clung to her frame, professional yet alluring. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, missed nothing. She saw the banker in the corner booth discreetly sliding a keycard to his mistress, the city councilman laughing a little too loudly with a man whose face never appeared in the papers, and the subtle tension in her father's shoulders as he watched the room from his usual shadowed alcove. "Another round for Mr. Sterling, Leo," she said softly to the bartender, her voice a low counterpoint to the saxophone's cry. She gestured with a slight nod toward a portly man trying to impress a date with a bottle of scotch that cost more than her first piano. "And make sure it's from the top shelf, the real top shelf." Leo, a mountain of a man with a gentle face, grinned. "The one that doesn't exist on the inventory? That's the one," Nora confirmed, her lips twitching into a faint smile. This was her world. A gilded cage indeed. It was beautiful, opulent, and provided a life of comfort. But every polished surface, every vintage bottle, was paid for by the illicit spirits distilled in the hidden cellars below and the silent agreements that kept the law looking the other way. Her father, Finn Hayes, was a relic of an older Chicago, a man who believed in loyalty, family, and the fine art of running a business just outside the reach of the government. He had taught her everything: how to balance the books to appear legitimate, how to spot a plainclothes officer by the scuff of his shoes, and how to smile while saying no in a way that left no room for argument. She was a good daughter, a dutiful one. But as the saxophone's lament filled the space, a familiar ache bloomed in her chest. The melody was a story of longing, of dreams just out of reach. It was the music she wrote in secret, late at night in her small apartment, the pages of sheet music hidden away like a forbidden love affair. Her dream wasn't here, surrounded by whispers and shadows. It was in a sun-drenched courtyard in New Orleans, in a small, honest club of her own, where the only thing being sold was the music itself. A sudden chill cut through the warm, close air as the front door opened, admitting a swirl of the biting autumn wind off Lake Michigan. It wasn't the cold that made Nora's eyes snap toward the entrance. It was the man who stood there. He wasn't a regular. She knew every face that came through her door, but he was a stranger. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him a silhouette of power and stillness. While other men entered the Gilded Cage with a boisterous air, seeking to be seen, this man entered as if he already owned the silence that followed his arrival. The saxophonist faltered for a single discordant note before recovering. The hum of conversation in the room dipped, a collective, subconscious recognition of a predator entering the fold. He swept the room with a gaze that was cold and sharp as splintered ice. His eyes, a slate gray that promised nothing but storms, paused for a fraction of a second on her father before finally landing on Nora behind the bar. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, he just looked at her. It wasn't a look of flirtation or appraisal. It was one of assessment, of calculation, as if he were dismantling her, piece by piece, to see how she worked. Then, with a slow, deliberate confidence, he began to walk toward the bar. Each step was silent, measured, and utterly menacing. The wind howled softly as the door clicked shut behind him, but Nora knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the real storm had just walked inside. The man moved with the lethal grace of a panther, the crowd parting for him as if by an instinctual, primal fear. He didn't look at them, his attention fixed solely on Nora. When he reached the bar, he didn't take a seat, choosing instead to stand, creating an immediate and undeniable imbalance of power. Up close, he was even more imposing. His suit was charcoal gray, the fabric so fine it seemed to drink the low light. His face was all sharp angles and severe planes, a face carved from granite and unforgiving winters. Nora placed both hands flat on the cool surface of the bar, a small, grounding gesture. She would not show fear. Fear was a currency in this city, and she refused to be spent. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the frantic drumming in her chest. "What can I get for you?" His storm gray eyes scanned the impressive wall of bottles behind her before returning to her face. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, quiet rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. It was a voice that didn't need to be raised to command obedience. "Surprise me," he said. "Not with your most expensive, with your best." It was a test, a challenge. Most men in his position would order something flashy to broadcast their wealth. He was asking for substance. Nora felt a flicker of grudging respect before crushing it. She turned, her movements fluid, and retrieved a simple, unlabeled bottle of amber liquid from a discreet shelf below the counter. She placed a heavy crystal tumbler on the bar and poured 2 fingers of the whiskey, the rich scent of oak and spiced grain rising between them. "Our own stock," she explained, pushing the glass gently toward him. "A 10-year rye. We call it the Lullaby. Small batch. You won't find it on any menu." He lifted the glass, not drinking immediately, but observing the color, the way the liquid clung to the crystal. An off-the-books lullaby for a city that never sleeps. Fitting. His gaze lifted to meet hers over the rim of the glass. "I'm Cole, Treasury Department, Financial Crimes." There it was. Not a hint, not a veiled threat, but a declaration of war delivered with the calm of a man ordering his morning coffee. The air in Nora's lungs turned to ice. The Treasury Department, the one government branch with the power and patience to unravel the complex financial tapestry her family had woven for 2 generations. She forced a placid, professional smile onto her face, a mask she had perfected over years. "Welcome to the Gilded Cage, Mr. Cole. I hope our accounting is to your satisfaction." A corner of his mouth tilted, a cold, sharp movement that held no warmth. "That remains to be seen." He finally took a sip of the whiskey. His eyes closed for a brief moment as he savored it, and when they opened again, they held a dangerous glint of appreciation. "This is very good. Complex. A hint of smoke at the end." He set the glass down with a quiet, definitive click. "Whoever makes this is a true artist. It's a shame it's all completely illegal." Every word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. "We're a jazz bar, Mr. Cole," Nora replied smoothly, already clearing the glass, wanting this interaction to be over. "We specialize in artists." "So I see," he murmured, his gaze sweeping the room again, but this time she knew what he was looking for. He wasn't admiring the decor. He was cataloging exit points, counting security personnel, estimating the room's capacity. He was dismantling her cage, bar by gilded bar. He stayed for 10 more minutes, an eternity in which Nora felt every nerve ending ignite. He didn't speak again, simply finished his drink in slow, deliberate sips, his presence a vortex of silence that warped the room around him. When he was done, he placed a crisp $100 bill on the bar, far too much for a single drink. "For the artist," he said, his voice low and for her ears only. He turned and walked away without a backward glance. As the door swung shut behind him, it was as if the room collectively exhaled. The saxophone found its rhythm again. The chatter rose to its previous level, but the illusion of safety had been shattered. A moment later, her father materialized from the shadows, his weathered face etched with a deep, familiar worry. Finn Hayes was a big man, but tonight he seemed smaller. "Treasury?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Nora simply nodded, her throat tight. "This isn't some beat cop looking for a handout," Finn murmured, his gaze on the door as if he could still see the ghost who had passed through it. "This is different." Nora looked down at the $100 bill. It wasn't a tip, it was a message. It was the first down payment on the destruction of her world. The saxophone played on, but the sweet, soulful melody now sounded like a dirge. For 3 days, a deceptive calm settled over the Gilded Cage. The silence from Agent Cole was louder than any threat he could have made. It was a coiled silence, full of waiting. Nora and her father moved through their routines with a heightened, almost painful awareness. Every new face was scrutinized, every delivery double-checked. Nora found herself poring over ledgers she already knew by heart, searching for the one thread he might pull that would unravel everything. He returned on a Tuesday afternoon, a time when the bar was a hollow echo of its nocturnal self. Sunlight, thin and gray, struggled through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The lingering smell of last night's whiskey was gone, replaced by the sterile scent of lemon polish. Nora was at a corner table, a laptop open in front of her, a stack of invoices to one side, and a well-worn book of Chopin's nocturnes on the other. The chime of the bell above the door was soft, but it sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. It was him. He wasn't wearing the severe suit from his first visit. Today it was a dark cashmere turtleneck and tailored trousers, an outfit that was somehow more dangerous in its casual elegance. It was the attire of a man who belonged in places of power, not a government agent on a field investigation. He moved into the room and the afternoon light seemed to shrink away from him. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her, his voice as quiet as the room itself. "Working hard?" Nora closed her laptop slowly, her mind already racing, building walls, fortifying defenses. "The work is never done, Mr. Cole." She gestured to the empty chair opposite her. "To what do we owe the pleasure? I doubt you're here for the lunchtime specials." He ignored the chair, choosing instead to wander toward the small stage where the jazz trio performed nightly. He ran a hand along the polished wood of the piano, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I was curious about the history of this place. Establishments like this, they have stories, layers. It was the opening move in their waltz, a deceptively simple step. My grandfather opened it after the war," Nora supplied, her voice even and pleasant. It was their official, well-rehearsed history. He wanted to bring a little beauty back into the world. "We've been a fixture in the neighborhood ever since." "A fixture," Cole repeated, turning to face her, his gray eyes unreadable. "That's one word for it. It's a competitive market, especially now. And yet, the Gilded Cage thrives. You must have some very loyal suppliers to maintain this quality." The second step, a subtle probe aimed at their supply chain. "We do," Nora said, offering a small, confident smile. "My father believes in loyalty. We've had contracts with the same distributors for decades. People appreciate consistency. I'm sure they do." He began to walk back toward her table, his pace unhurried. "Like your contract with Varelli Imports for your French brandies. Old man Varelli was a legend. A handshake deal with him was worth more than a signed contract with anyone else." Nora's heart gave a painful lurch. Varelli Imports was one of their main fronts. "You've done your research," she said, her voice a little tighter than she wanted. "It's my job to do research." He finally stopped in front of her table, looking down at her. He wasn't menacing, merely stating a fact. "It's also my job to notice when things don't add up. For instance, Varelli Imports officially ceased all operations and filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 8 months ago, following the death of its founder." The music stopped. Her perfectly constructed lie lay shattered on the floor between them. He had seen the crack in her facade and pressed his finger right into it. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Nora felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This man wasn't just investigating, he was dissecting. Her mind scrambled for a new story, a new angle, but for the first time, she was at a loss. His gaze dropped from her face to the items on her table. He gestured toward the book, Chopin, full of passion and sorrow. He looked back at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes was replaced by something else, something knowing and almost melancholic. A romantic choice for someone so pragmatic. The personal observation was more disarming than any of his threats. It was a glimpse behind the mask, a suggestion that he saw her, not just the daughter of a criminal. He reached into his jacket and pulled out not a file but his wallet. He placed a $20 bill on the table. "For the coffee I never ordered," he said. The agent was back, the moment of connection gone as quickly as it had appeared. "It's a beautiful cage you have here, Miss Hayes. But the thing about cages is that they have locks, and all locks have keys." He turned and left, the bell chiming his exit. Nora stared at the door, her breath caught in her throat. The game had changed. This wasn't a routine investigation, it was a hunt. And she and her father were the prey in a carefully choreographed dance with a wolf who knew all their steps. To escape the oppressive weight of her father's worry and the phantom presence of Agent Cole, Nora sought refuge in the one place in Chicago that felt truly hers, a dusty, labyrinthine bookstore in the West Loop, where the scent of aging paper and leather bindings offered a temporary truce with the world. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could be just Nora, a woman who loved stories and the quiet promise of other lives tucked away on shelves. She was running her fingers along a row of poetry when a shadow fell over the page she was considering. "Finding anything good?" The voice was unmistakable, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight up her spine. Nora froze, her hand hovering over a collection by Edna Street Vincent Millay. She didn't need to turn around. He had found her here, in her one safe place, and the violation of it felt like a physical blow. She took a slow, deliberate breath and turned to face him. Agent Cole stood there, holding a thin volume of Dostoevsky. He was dressed even more casually than before, in a simple gray Henley that stretched across a broad chest and dark, well-worn jeans. Without the armor of a suit or the authority of his badge, he looked younger, more approachable, and infinitely more dangerous. "I didn't realize the Treasury Department had a required reading list," Nora said, her voice sharp with an edge she couldn't hide. He offered a slight, disarming smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes, but it changed the harsh lines of his face. Even government agents need a day off. Besides, Dostoevsky understood criminals better than most cops. He glanced at the book in her hand. "Malay, my candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. A bit fatalistic, don't you think?" "I think it's honest," she retorted, placing the book back on the shelf with a definitive snap. This was his new strategy, to peel back the layers of her life, to find the woman underneath the speakeasy manager. He was mapping her vulnerabilities. "So this is what you do when you're not managing the city's most interesting jazz bar?" he asked, falling into step beside her as she moved deeper into the aisles. "Hide out with dead poets?" "It's just a hobby," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She hated the way she had to shrink her passions into something small and insignificant for his consumption. "Running the family business takes up all my time." "A shame," he murmured, his voice too close to her ear. She could feel the warmth of his body even from a foot away. Running a business is a skill, but a love for art, that's a part of the soul. They stopped in front of a section on musical history. He picked up a heavy, photo-laden book on the birth of New Orleans jazz. He didn't open it, just held it, his thumb tracing the outline of a trumpet on the cover. "You have a real passion for the music at your bar," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I see it when you watch the saxophonist. You're not just listening to the notes, you're feeling them." As I said, a hobby. The lie was weaker this time, a threadbare defense against his unnerving perception. He turned his full attention to her, his gray eyes intense, searching. "Why lie about something so harmless, Nora?" Hearing her first name from his lips was a shock, a deliberate crossing of a line. It was an assertion of intimacy that did not exist, and yet it sent a strange, unwanted tremor through her. "I'm not lying," she insisted, lifting her chin, "and I'd prefer you call me Miss Hayes." "Of course," he said, his expression unchanging, but she knew he had registered her reaction. He had found a weak spot. He placed the jazz book back on the shelf, his movements precise. "Forgive the intrusion. I was just surprised to see a familiar face." He gave her a slight nod, a gesture of finality, and walked away, disappearing around a towering shelf of history books. Nora stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but she felt as if she had just run a marathon. He had said nothing overtly threatening, asked no incriminating questions, yet it was the most unnerving conversation she'd ever had. He wasn't just investigating her father's business, he was investigating her. That evening, Nora sat at the small piano in her apartment, the city lights twinkling like fallen stars outside her window. Her fingers rested on the cool ivory keys, but the melodies in her head were silent, choked by the sweet little lies she had been forced to tell. He had seen a glimpse of her soul in that bookstore, and she had immediately slammed the door shut. She looked at the pages of music she had written, the complex chords and soaring melodies that were the truest parts of herself. He was right. It was a shame. And for the first time, she wasn't just afraid of what Agent Cole might do to her family. She was afraid of what he was beginning to do to her. Friday night, and the Gilded Cage was alive. The air, thick and shimmering under the low lights, vibrated with the brassy, exuberant notes of a swing number. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of 100 conversations. It was the kind of night where the profits flowed as freely as the champagne, and for a few hours, Nora allowed the infectious energy of the crowd to soothe the knot of tension in her stomach. For the first time all week, Agent Cole felt like a distant specter, a bad dream that faded with the morning light. She was sharing a quiet, satisfied look with her father when she saw it. Leo, their stoic bartender, was polishing a glass, but his movements were stiff. He met her gaze in the mirror behind the bar and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. A single, sharp gesture. Trouble. Nora's blood ran cold. She excused herself from the conversation with a practiced smile and made her way to the bar, her path a fluid, weaving dance through the throng. "What is it?" she murmured, her back to the room as she pretended to inspect a bottle of gin. "Mickey on the force just called," Leo whispered, his voice a low rumble. "It's not a raid. Worse. A surprise inspection. Liquor board, backed by a police detail. They're 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. An eternity and no time at all. This wasn't a clumsy shakedown. It was a surgical strike. It was Cole's handiwork. She was sure of it. He was done with the waltz. Now he was trying to set the stage on fire. For a heartbeat, panic seized her. Then, years of training took over. She gave Leo a sharp, single nod. He turned and caught the eye of the band leader on stage. A moment later, the joyful swing number faltered, melting into the slow, mournful opening bars of Gloomy Sunday. The change in music was the first signal, the emergency protocol they had rehearsed a dozen times but never had to use. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The core staff, trained for this moment, moved with silent, purposeful speed. Bartenders began discreetly clearing the counter of the unlabeled house bottles, stowing them in hidden, spring-loaded compartments beneath the bar. Waitstaff carrying trays of empty glasses made their way to the private booths, murmuring apologies and collecting the illicit rye and moonshine carafes, replacing them with legitimate, tax-stamped whiskeys. Nora became the picture of grace under pressure. She moved to the center of the room, a radiant, untroubled smile on her face. "My apologies for interrupting everyone's evening," she announced, her voice carrying over the melancholy piano chords. "But the Gilded Cage is now closed for a private event. Please finish your drinks. Your entire tab for the evening is on the house, as a thank you for your patronage." A wave of confused but pleased murmurs rippled through the crowd. Free drinks from Finn Hayes? Unheard of. Within 5 minutes, guided by the polite but firm staff, the city's elite were happily making their way to the exit, oblivious to the fact they were fleeing a sinking ship. As the last patron disappeared, the heavy front doors swung open again. 2 uniformed officers, a grim-faced woman in a suit holding a clipboard, and behind them all, leaning against the doorframe as if he were just a casual observer, stood Agent Cole. His eyes found Nora's across the now cavernous room, and they held a look of cold, clinical curiosity. He was here to watch his experiment unfold. "Nora Hayes?" the woman with the clipboard asked, her voice flat. "I'm Agent Miller, Illinois Liquor Control Commission. We're here to conduct a spot inspection of your premises and inventory." "Of course," Nora replied, her voice a calm oasis in the tense silence. "My father and I have nothing to hide. Please, feel free to look around." What followed was a slow, agonizing search. They checked the storerooms, cross-referenced her, meticulously forged, manifests, and ran chemical swabs across her bar taps. Nora stood by, answering every question with unwavering calm, her father a silent, immovable mountain at her back. At one point, Cole detached himself from the doorway and approached her, his movements silent. He stopped beside her, standing too close, his presence a palpable force. "You handle chaos well, Miss Hayes," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it over the sound of officers opening crates. "It's an admirable quality." She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on Agent Miller. "This is just business as usual, Agent," she lied coolly. "You'll have to try harder than this to rattle me." She felt, more than saw, his gaze drop to her hand, which was clutching a pen. To her horror, she saw a slight, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers, the only betrayal of the terror screaming inside her. He saw it too. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips before vanishing. Finally, after an hour that felt like a lifetime, Agent Miller slammed her clipboard shut in frustration. "Everything appears to be in order. For now." The words hung in the air, a promise of future harassment. They left, their footsteps echoing in the empty bar. Cole was the last to go. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the streetlights. He gave her a long look, no longer curious, but filled with a new sharp-edged respect. He had tested her, and she had not broken. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut, plunging the room into silence. The adrenaline drained out of Nora in a dizzying rush, and she leaned back against the bar for support. The immediate danger was gone, but the truth of their situation had been laid bare. They were no longer operating in the shadows. They were living in a cage, and a very patient, very intelligent man was standing on the outside, testing the strength of every single bar. In the week following the near raid, a heavy, watchful silence descended. Cole did not return. No more agents appeared. This absence of pressure was, in its own way, more unnerving than his presence. It left Nora feeling like a character in a play, waiting for a cue that never came. To project an image of unwavering stability, her father insisted they attend the annual Chicago Benevolent Society Gala, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. It was a necessary performance, a way of reminding the city's elite that the Hayes family and the Gilded Cage were unshakable institutions. Nora hated it. She felt like an imposter in her borrowed emerald gown, the silk whispering against her skin like a lie. The room was a sea of forced smiles, air kisses, and conversations as hollow and brilliant as the crystal chandeliers overhead. She was nursing a glass of champagne, letting the polite chatter wash over her, when she saw him. He was standing across the room, deep in conversation with Senator Rawlings. But it wasn't Agent Cole. The man he was presenting to the world tonight was someone entirely different. This man was dressed in a flawlessly tailored tuxedo, a vision of dark, sophisticated power. He laughed at something the senator said, a smooth, easy sound that reached his eyes, making them gleam with charisma. He moved with the relaxed, predatory grace of a man who owned every room he entered. A name was whispered by a woman next to her, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and trepidation. That's Damien Thorne, the reclusive head of Onyx Acquisitions. They say he can make or break a company with a single phone call. Nora's champagne glass nearly slipped from her numb fingers. Damien Thorne, the Onyx Syndicate, her father's most feared and mysterious competitor. Not a government agent, a rival king. The man threatening her family wasn't trying to uphold the law. He was trying to tear down their kingdom to expand his own. The sheer audacity and brilliance of his deception stole her breath. He had been playing a completely different game all along. Her blood turned to ice, then boiled with a white-hot fury. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head, and his eyes, the same storm-gray eyes, locked with hers from across the ballroom. The charming smile never left his face, but a spark of something cold and triumphant ignited in their depths. He knew that she knew. He excused himself from the senator and began making his way toward her, a shark gliding through placid waters. Nora's every instinct screamed at her to run, but she was rooted to the spot, trapped in the performance. He stopped in front of her, his presence eclipsing the glitter and noise of the party. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone so different from Agent Cole's clipped, menacing tone. Damien Thorne. He extended a hand. To refuse would be to cause a scene. Her hand, when she placed it in his, was ice cold. His grip was warm and firm. "Nora Hayes," she managed, her voice a flawless imitation of polite society. "A pleasure." "The pleasure is all mine," Damien said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous amusement as he held her hand a second too long. "I've heard of your family's establishment, the Gilded Cage. A true Chicago landmark. We try to maintain a certain standard," she replied, her words laced with a double meaning she knew he would understand perfectly. They were trapped in a charade, a public dance of civility, while a silent, vicious war raged in the space between them. And then, something shifted. The string quartet on the dais began a new piece, a haunting, familiar waltz. Damien's gaze drifted past her, toward the dance floor, where an elderly couple was swaying gently to the music, their movements full of a lifetime of shared affection. The polished mask of Damien Thorne cracked. It was an infinitesimal change, a flicker in his expression that no one else would have noticed. But Nora, whose survival depended on reading the subtleties of powerful men, saw it clearly. A shadow of profound, gut-wrenching sorrow passed through his eyes. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and for a single, unguarded moment, he wasn't a crime lord or a fake agent. He was a man staring at a ghost. "My parents used to dance to this song," he murmured, his voice so quiet she barely heard him. The words were raw, stripped of all artifice, and he seemed almost startled to have spoken them aloud. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and shocking. In that one moment, she saw behind the mask, glimpsing a cavern of old pain. It didn't excuse the lies or the threats, but it changed him. It gave his cruelty a context, a history. It made him terrifyingly human. He recovered almost instantly, the mask of cool charisma snapping back into place. But the damage was done. He looked at her, and she knew that he knew what she had seen. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. "Enjoy the evening, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice once again smooth and detached. He gave her a polite nod and turned, melting back into the crowd as if the moment had never happened. Nora stood frozen, the ghost of his touch still on her hand, the echo of his pain resonating in her soul. The lies, the investigation, the turf war, all of it suddenly felt secondary to the devastating truth she had just witnessed. It was easy to fight a monster, but how did you fight a man whose wounds you had seen? The revelation at the gala had poisoned the air. Every shadow in the Gilded Cage now seemed to hold the shape of Damien Thorne. He was no longer a specter of the law. He was the enemy king, and his pieces were already on the board while she was just learning the name of the game. The anger was a constant, simmering heat beneath Nora's skin, but underneath it was a more dangerous emotion, a consuming curiosity about the man who hid his grief behind a mask of ruthless power. A few nights later, the oppressive humidity of late summer finally broke in a torrential downpour. The sound of rain drumming on the roof was a frantic, chaotic rhythm. Finding it impossible to concentrate, Nora slipped out the back door into the service alley for a breath of air that wasn't choked with secrets. The rain fell in silver sheets, plastering strands of her hair to her cheeks and soaking the shoulders of her dress. The alley smelled of wet pavement and ozone. He stepped out of the deep shadows of the adjoining building as if he were born from them. There were no masks tonight. Not the cold agent, not the charming billionaire. He was just a man, dressed in a dark jacket that was soaked through, his black hair slicked back from his face by the rain. He didn't speak, just watched her, his gray eyes reflecting the dim, watery light. All the fear and fury of the past weeks coalesced into a single, sharp point in Nora's chest. "Damien Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "Head of the Onyx Syndicate, you have an incredible amount of nerve showing your face here." He didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He took a slow step forward. Agent Cole served his purpose. I needed to see the operation for myself. I needed to see the woman who kept its heart beating. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "I will admit, I underestimated you. You lied to me," she shot back, taking a step forward herself, refusing to be intimidated. "You threatened my family, my home. This isn't a game, isn't it?" he countered, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Your father sells illegal liquor out of a place called the Gilded Cage. Your entire world is a beautiful, elaborate lie. We are not so different, you and I. We both do what is necessary to protect what is ours. Don't you dare compare yourself to me," she hissed. "I saw you at that party. That moment you looked at the dancers. Was that part of the act too? A flicker of humanity to throw me off balance?" The moment she said it, she knew she had hit a nerve. His face, already a stark mask in the dim light, hardened into something truly forbidding. The air crackled. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his larger frame trapping her against the cold, wet brick of the alley wall. The rain dripped from his hair onto her face. "You see too much, Nora," he growled, his voice a raw whisper. His hands came up to brace the wall on either side of her head, caging her completely. He was furious. Not at her accusation, she realized, but at the truth of it. Furious that she had seen that one, unguarded piece of his soul. The proximity was suffocating, intoxicating. She could see the flecks of charcoal in his gray eyes, feel the heat radiating from his body despite the cold rain. Her anger was met with his, her defiance with his dominance. It was a volatile, impossible chemistry, a mixture of hatred and fascination that had been building since the moment he first walked into her bar. With nowhere else to go, it ignited. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth. The world seemed to fall away, the rain, the city, the war between their families, leaving only the charged, impossible space between their lips. He crushed his mouth to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, punishing act of possession. It was all of his anger and her fury, all of his control and her defiance, poured into a single, searing moment. It was the taste of whiskey and rain and secrets too dark to speak. For a split second, Nora was rigid with shock, and then a tidal wave of her own conflicted emotions rose up to meet his. She kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own. Her hands, which had been pressed against his chest to push him away, tangled in the wet fabric of his jacket, pulling him closer. It was a surrender, a confession, an admission of the terrifying, undeniable truth that had been arcing between them from the very start. The kiss broke as suddenly as it had begun. They pulled apart, breathing hard, their chests heaving. Rain and the raw shock of what they had done hung in the air between them. Damien stared at her, his eyes wide, the fury replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked like a man who had just set fire to his own rulebook, utterly lost. The mask was gone. Without another word, without a sound, he dropped his hands, took a step back, and vanished into the stormy darkness from which he came. Nora remained pressed against the wall, trembling, the rain washing over her face but failing to extinguish the fire on her lips. She slowly raised her fingers to touch her mouth. He had come to destroy her world. Instead, with one forbidden, devastating kiss, he had just set hers and his own on fire. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended over the glittering, indifferent city. It was Damien Thorne's sanctuary, a place of minimalist design and absolute monastic order. Every surface was polished, every line was clean, and every object had its place. It was the physical manifestation of the control he exerted over his life and his empire. Tonight it felt like a prison. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching the storm finally break over Lake Michigan. He hadn't touched the drink. For the last hour, he had stood there, replaying the scene in the alley. The rain, the anger in her moss-green eyes, the impossible, electrifying shock of her lips on his. A had lost control. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. Damien, the ghost Thorne, the man who moved through the underworld with the precision of a surgeon and the emotional detachment of a god, had been undone by a woman who smelled of old books and whiskey. He had gone there to intimidate her, to tighten the screws, and had instead revealed a weakness he didn't even know he possessed. The kiss was a catastrophic miscalculation, an emotional indulgence he could not afford. He was furious with her for drawing it out of him, but a deeper, colder fury was directed at himself. He raised the glass and downed the scotch in one fiery gulp, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. A discreet chime sounded. His second in command, Julian, entered the room. Julian was a pale, thin man with the calm, unassuming demeanor of an accountant, which made his utter ruthlessness all the more effective. "The Petrov situation has escalated," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion as he handed Damien a tablet. "He's refusing to cede the shipping routes. He called our offer an insult and is attempting to rally the old families against us." Damien scrolled through the report, his face a mask of cold indifference. This was familiar territory. This was control. This was the world where he was king. The memory of Nora's kiss was an unwelcome warmth, a contamination he needed to purge. "Petrov is a sentimental fool," Damien said, his voice clipped and hard. He handed the tablet back. "He thinks this is a street war. He still believes in honor and territory." Damien turned from the window, his eyes glacial. "We will teach him a new lesson. I don't want a message sent. I want a ghost created. Erase him. Not his life, his enterprise. Seize his digital assets, reroute his supply chains to our own networks, and drain his offshore accounts. By sunrise, I want Ivan Petrov to be a man with nothing but the suit he's standing in. When the old families see that the Onyx Syndicate can make a man vanish without spilling a drop of blood, they will understand the new face of power." "It will be done," Julian said with a slight bow, not a flicker of surprise on his face. He turned and left as silently as he had entered. The order was given. A man's empire would be dismantled overnight. Damien felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a problem being solved. The ghost was back. He had reasserted control. But as the silence of the penthouse settled around him once more, her face swam in his vision. "I saw you at that party. Was that a lie, too?" He strode into his office, the room even more sterile and impersonal than the last. He keyed a code into a biometric safe hidden behind a panel of smoked glass. The door hissed open, revealing not cash or weapons, but a single, small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, shaped like a heart. He opened it. On one side was a faded photograph of a laughing woman with kind eyes. On the other, a handsome man with a proud smile. His parents. He remembered the night this photo was taken, a summer festival, the air filled with music and the smell of cotton candy. He'd been 6 years old. A month later, they were dead, betrayed by their own allies in a brutal power play. He hadn't seen the act itself, but he had seen the aftermath. And he had seen the man standing by the getaway car, his face pale in the flashing red lights, a young, terrified enforcer who did nothing, a man who watched it happen and then melted back into the shadows of the city. A young Finn Hayes. Damien's entire life, the empire he had built, the ghost he had become, was all forged in the fire of that single memory. It was a promise he had made to the two smiling faces in the locket. He would tear down the old world, the world of petty loyalties and bloody betrayals that had taken them from him. He would erase every last remnant of it. Starting with Finn Hayes, he looked at the locket, then at his own reflection in the dark glass of the safe. He saw the cold, empty eyes of the man he had become. Nora, with her fire and her secret melodies, had, for a moment, made him feel like someone else. Someone he might have been if that night had never happened. The thought was a fatal weakness. With a definitive click, he closed the locket, shutting the smiling faces away in the dark. The past was not a memory, it was a debt, and it would be paid in full. The girl would be a casualty of war. She had to be. The ghost had a promise to keep. The kiss in the rain-swept alley had left a brand, an invisible mark that Nora felt with every breath. Her anger was still there, a righteous, simmering thing, but it was now tainted by something far more complex and dangerous. Understanding. She had seen the crack in Damien Thorne's armor, and that kiss, for all its brutality, had been a confession, an admission that she had gotten under his skin too. The balance of power had shifted. She was no longer the passive prey waiting for the wolf to strike. She would become a hunter. The next day, Nora didn't go to the Gilded Cage. Instead, she turned her small apartment into a command center. For years, she had only used the skills her father taught her for defense. Now, she would use them for offense. Opening an encrypted laptop, a tool she rarely touched, she went to work. Onyx Acquisitions, Damien Thorne. He was, as his nickname suggested, a ghost. His digital footprint was almost non-existent. Onyx Acquisitions was a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore investments, and impeccably legal transactions. On the surface, it was an astonishingly successful private equity firm. There was nothing to suggest it was a front for a criminal syndicate. He was good, terrifyingly good. Nora wasn't looking for proof of a crime. She was looking for the man. She dove into old news archives, forgotten public records, and the dark corners of the web. She searched for the name Thorne. For hours, she found nothing. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air. Then she changed her tactics. She wasn't looking for Damien. She was looking for the cataclysmic event, the power vacuum in Chicago's underworld 2 decades ago that could have created a monster like him. And then she found it. A small, digitized article from the Chicago Tribune, buried in the archives. It reported a tragic house fire that had claimed the lives of a married couple, Alexander and Isabella Thorne. The police had ruled it an accident, faulty wiring, but the article mentioned, in passing, that Alexander Thorne was a known underworld figure, a rising star with alleged ties to the old crime families. The story had died quickly, buried by bigger headlines. Thorne. A cold dread trickled down Nora's spine. She dug deeper, using the skills her father had taught her to access restricted databases. She found the birth certificate. Damien Thorne, born to Alexander and Isabella Thorne. He would have been 8 years old when they died. Her heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't a turf war, this was a vendetta. But that still didn't explain the connection to her family. The Hayes had always been neutral, the quiet bootleggers who never took a side in the power struggles. Their survival had depended on it. Driven by a frantic need to understand, Nora left her apartment and went to the Gilded Cage. She bypassed the bar and went straight to her father's office. The room was filled with old ledgers and memorabilia. Her father was at his desk, but she barely saw him. Her eyes were fixed on a faded, framed photograph on the wall, a photo she had seen 1,000 times but never truly looked at. It was her grandfather, the bar's original founder, standing proudly in front of the establishment in the 1,970 seconds. He was flanked by a group of men, his early business associates. And standing in the back, a tall, handsome young man with a confident smile and bright eyes. The air left Nora's lungs in a rush. She had seen those eyes before, in a grainy news photo on her laptop screen. It was Alexander Thorne. Her family wasn't connected to the death of Damien's parents. They were at the very heart of it. The entire history of her family, the foundation of her safety and their prosperity, was built on a secret far darker than any illicit liquor they had ever distilled. She looked at her father, the man who had taught her about loyalty and silence, and for the first time in her life, she questioned everything. What was his silence hiding? To whom did his loyalty truly belong? The perfect facade of her world had just cracked, and beneath it lay not a fissure, but an abyss. And Damien Thorne was standing on the other side, waiting. The air in Finn Hayes' office was thick with the ghosts of unspoken words. Nora's hand, cold and trembling, lifted to point at the man in the photograph, whose smiling face now seemed to mock her from the past. "Who was he?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, almost a whisper. "Tell me about him, Dad. Tell me about Alexander Thorne." Finn Hayes, a man who had faced down federal agents and the city's most hardened criminals without so much as a flinch, seemed to physically recoil. For a moment, he aged a decade, the lines on his face deepening into chasms of weariness and sorrow. "That's old history, Nora," he said, his voice raspy. "It has nothing to do with us now. It has everything to do with us." Nora shot back, her voice finally breaking with anguish. "His son Damien is coming for us. He thinks we're responsible. Dad." She moved to his desk, her eyes pleading for a truth she was terrified to hear. "Are we?" The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Finn looked at his daughter, and the walls he had spent 30 years building around his heart began to crumble. He knew he could not protect her from this anymore. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a final surrender. "No," he whispered. Not in the way he thinks. And then the story spilled out. A toxic river that had been dammed for too long. The Hayes family hadn't always been neutral. Her grandfather, Seamus, was an ambitious man, and his best friend, his partner in business, was Alexander Thorne. They had built the Gilded Cage together from nothing, the foundation not just of a bar, but of an empire. But they flew too close to the sun, getting entangled with an older, more ruthless crime family, the Morettas. Alex wanted out, Finn said, his eyes distant, lost in a painful memory. Isabella had just had Damien. He wanted a legitimate life, a future for his boy, but he knew too much. To the Morettas, getting out was the same as betrayal. The Morettas delivered an order. They told Seamus Hayes he had a choice, his loyalty to his friend, or the safety of his own family. He was to help them set a trap for Alexander. Your grandfather, Finn said, his voice cracking. He chose us. The night it happened, Seamus lured Alexander to a fake meeting. And Finn, only 17 years old at the time, was the driver. I didn't know what they were going to do, he whispered, tears finally tracing paths down his weathered face. I swear I didn't. I was just a kid. I drove them to the Thorne house. I sat in the car down the street and I saw the fire start. I heard the screams. His voice choked on a sob. I did nothing, Nora. I was so scared. I saw everything and I did nothing. The truth landed like a physical blow. Her family's history wasn't built on honor, but on betrayal. Her beloved grandfather had sacrificed his best friend on the altar of fear. And her father, her hero, was haunted not by a crime he had committed, but by the cowardice that had stopped him from preventing one. She looked around the office, the ledgers, the photos, the memorabilia of a legacy. It was all a lie. The Gilded Cage wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb built on the bones of another family. And Damien, the 8-year-old boy who had lost everything in one night. His rage wasn't random cruelty. It was forged in grief and fed by betrayal. And to her horror, a part of her understood it. A part of her believed he was justified. Nora didn't cry. She felt a cold hollowness, a disillusionment so profound it was beyond tears. She looked at her father, a broken man imprisoned by his past, and then out into the void. She was caught between two ghosts, the ghost of the father she adored and the ghost of the man she might be falling for, both haunted by the same fateful night. The truth hadn't set her free. It had chained her to the center of a war she had no way of winning. The truth, once revealed, could not be put away. It filled every corner of Nora's world, coloring her memories and poisoning her future. She could not sit and wait for Damien to enact his life's long-plotted revenge. She had to face him, not with lies or defiance, but with the very weapon she had just unearthed, the cold, brutal truth. Using a burner phone, she dialed the encrypted number she had found during her investigation, a direct line to him. Her heart hammered as she pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. "It's me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. A pause. "Nora." He said her name like an accusation. "Navy Pier." "The North Dock," she commanded, not pleaded. "1 hour. Come alone." She hung up before he could reply. An hour later, she stood at the deserted end of the pier. A frigid wind blew off Lake Michigan, whipping strands of her hair across her face. The city lights glittered in the distance, a faraway galaxy that no longer felt like her own. She felt utterly exposed, a lone figure against an endless expanse of black, churning water. He arrived like an apparition, his tall frame materializing from the shadows. He stopped a few feet from her, cautious, wary. The wind billowed his dark coat around him. Nora didn't waste time. "My grandfather betrayed your father," she said, the words carried away by the wind. "He chose his family over his friend, and it cost you yours. My father was there. He was a boy, and he did nothing." The blunt confession struck him with visible force. Damien stood motionless, his face a stark, unreadable mask in the dim light. He had expected pleas, denials, bargains. He had not expected a full, unflinching surrender. His initial shock quickly hardened into a cold, terrifying rage. His revenge, his life's purpose, had just been validated from her own lips. "So you admit it," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Your entire family is built on the bones of mine." "There are no excuses for what my grandfather did," Nora said, her voice thick with the emotion she was fighting to control. Hot tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "But my father, he has lived in a prison of his own making for 30 years. He is a ghost, just like you." "Don't you speak to me of your father," he roared, taking a step toward her, his fury a tangible thing in the air. He stood by and watched my parents die. His cowardice bought him a life, and your family has prospered on the ashes of mine. And what about your revenge, Damien? She shot back, her voice rising to meet his. Will it bring them back? Will destroying my father absolve him? No, it won't fix what's broken. It will just create more ghosts. He stared at her, his gray eyes blazing like embers. That kiss, he said cruelly, throwing the words at her like daggers. Was that part of this? Were you trying to seduce your way out of a blood debt? The accusation slapped the control from her. That kiss was the only true thing that has happened between us, she screamed, her heartbreak and fury finally erupting. It wasn't a strategy, it was a mistake, and we both made it. You know it. The raw truth of her words hit him. It sliced through his rage and touched the chaos beneath. He was a man who dealt in lies and strategy. Her raw, emotional honesty was an attack he had no defense for. Their confrontation hung in a stalemate, both of them breathing heavily in the cold wind. His rage was still there, but it was now clouded by confusion. She hadn't fought him. She had held up a mirror to his own tragedy. This changes nothing, he said. The words cold, but the conviction had faded. The debt will be paid. He turned and started to walk away, but then he stopped. He hesitated for a single, charged second, and glanced back at her over his shoulder. In that moment, his face wasn't the mask of the ghost, but that of a man torn between his fury and something that looked agonizingly like regret. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving her alone on the pier. Nora stood trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. She had laid the truth of both their families bare. Her heart was broken for the tragedy that bound them, but underneath the pain, a new resolve had hardened. She would not let the past destroy anyone else. Damien drove for hours after leaving the pier, the city lights blurring into streaks of meaningless color. He didn't return to the cold sanctuary of his penthouse. Instead, he found himself drawn to a quiet, tree-lined street in a respectable suburb, a place he hadn't visited in 20 years. He parked the car and stared at the empty lot. It was a perfectly manicured square of grass, nestled between two sprawling, happy-looking homes, a pristine green scar where his life had been burned to the ground. This was where his house had stood. This was where he had lost everything. Nora's words echoed in the profound silence of the place. He is a ghost, just like you. It will just create more ghosts. For his entire adult life, his purpose had been a diamond, hard and clear and sharp. His pain had been his fuel, his rage, the engine of his ascent. He had hunted down every last member of the Moretti family, dismantling their empire with a silent, systematic brutality that had become his legend. But he had saved the true architects of his pain for last, the betrayers, the Hayes family. His narrative was simple, clean, and righteous. Nora had taken that simple narrative and shattered it. She had shown him the other side of the story, a tale not of malice, but of fear and decades of crippling shame. She had forced him to see her father not as a monster, but as a haunted, broken man. He reached into his coat, his fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal of his mother's locket. He clicked it open. The faces of his parents smiled up at him, frozen in a time before the fire and the betrayal. This was his truth. This was his debt of blood. Her story, however tragic, could not erase theirs. He saw her face then, as she stood on the pier, the wind whipping her hair, her eyes filled not with defiance, but with a sorrow that mirrored his own. He remembered the kiss, the impossible, incendiary moment when their two broken worlds had collided. He had dismissed it as a weakness, a lapse in control. But what if it was, as she had claimed, the only true thing that had passed between them? The thought was a poison, weakening his resolve. He could not afford it. He had to reassert control. He had to remind himself who he was and what he was here to do. He pulled out his phone, his movements sharp and decisive. He dialed Julian. "It's time," Damien said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He was the ghost again. "Begin phase 1. Sir?" Julian's voice was calm, awaiting orders. "I want every legitimate financial asset tied to Finn Hayes and his known associates frozen by morning," Damien commanded, his eyes fixed on the empty lot. "Lean on our contacts at the banks. Create an anonymous tip to the IRS regarding untaxed offshore assets. I don't want to break his kneecaps. I want to bleed him dry. I want to suffocate him in paperwork and red tape until he can't breathe." "Understood. The machine is in motion." "Good," Damien said and ended the call. He had done it. The first real shot in the war had been fired. A cold, familiar satisfaction settled over him. This was what he did. He dismantled his enemies, piece by piece, until they were nothing but a memory. But as he put the car in gear and pulled away from the ghost of his childhood home, the satisfaction felt hollow. The image of Nora's heartbroken, furious face on the pier superimposed itself over the memory of the flames. He had set his revenge in motion, an unstoppable force aimed at the heart of the Hayes family. But for the first time in his life, as he drove back into the city of ghosts, Damien Thorne was no longer certain that his vengeance was justice. He was beginning to fear it was just another tragedy. The attack, when it came, was silent and bloodless. It arrived not with the kick of a door, but with the quiet click of a mouse. By 10 a.m., every bank account connected to the Gilded Cage was frozen. An automated flag from the IRS had been triggered, citing suspected offshore tax evasion. Their legitimate suppliers suddenly canceled long-standing contracts, citing unforeseen financial risks. It was a corporate execution, elegant in its devastating simplicity. Finn Hayes sat in his office, staring at a stack of notices from the bank, looking like a man who had been dealt a fatal blow without ever seeing the fist. This was a war he didn't understand. Nora, however, understood it perfectly. This was the work of the ghost. It was Damien's signature move and attack not on the body but on the delicate architecture of a life, a business. While her father saw ruin, she saw a strategy. She was already on her laptop, searching for back channels, dormant accounts, any asset he might have missed. Her heartbreak from the pier had been transmuted into a cold, focused fury. "He's trying to suffocate us," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "He wants to cut off our oxygen, so we're forced to make a mistake." "It's working," Finn said, his voice a weary rumble. Just then, the private office line rang, a shrill, piercing sound. Nora snatched it up. It was Leo, the bartender, his voice strained with a panic she had never heard before. "Nora, it's the shipment from the north," he said, his words rushed. "The one coming down the I-90. It's gone." "Gone? What do you mean gone?" Nora demanded, a new, colder dread seeping into her veins. This wasn't part of Damien's playbook. Hijacked. But it wasn't clean. They found the truck abandoned an hour ago. The drivers, they're in the hospital, beaten badly. A pause. "Nora, they left something. A message. They spray-painted it on the side of the truck. A bull's head." Nora's blood ran cold. She looked at her father, whose face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with a terror she hadn't seen even during the police inspection. "What is it?" she pressed. "What does it mean?" Finn looked at her, his expression haunted. "It's the Morettis," he whispered, the name dropping into the room like a stone. The bull was their family crest. The Morettis. The crime family her grandfather had feared. The ones who had ordered the hit on Alexander and Isabella Thorne. The ones Damien had supposedly wiped from the face of the earth. "That's impossible," Nora breathed. "They're gone." "We thought they were," Finn said, a new, frantic energy in his voice. "After Damien was done with them years ago, the only one left was the youngest son, Luca. He was just a kid, fled to Europe. Everyone assumed he'd never come back." Miles away, in his penthouse, Damien Thorne stared at a tablet displaying a similar report. One of his own distribution hubs, a low-level facility on the south side, had been hit. The attack was crude, brutal, and loud. 3 of his men were hospitalized. It was a messy, unsophisticated act of aggression, completely antithetical to his own methods. Julian stood beside him, his face grim. "The local contacts are all saying the same thing. It's a declaration. Luca Moretti is back in Chicago, and he's consolidating power the old way." On the screen, Julian brought up a grainy security photo of a man stepping out of a black sedan. He was handsome, with slicked-back hair and the cruel, arrogant smile of a man who enjoyed violence. Luca Moretti. Damien's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. His personal, precise vendetta against the Hayes family, the betrayers had just been gate-crashed by the actual murderers. Luca Moretti wasn't just a business rival. He was a ghost from Damien's own past, a living embodiment of the fire and the rage that had created him. He had spent years hunting the men who killed his parents. He thought he had exorcised them all. Now, the final piece of that bloody puzzle had just appeared on his chessboard, not as a target, but as a player. A two-front war. On one side, the family whose cowardice had enabled his parents' murder. On the other, the son of the man who had ordered it. Back in the office of the Gilded Cage, Nora stared at her father, the frozen bank account suddenly a secondary problem. Damien wanted to ruin them. Luca Moretti wanted to bury them. She realized with a sickening certainty that the cold, calculating man she had confronted on the pier was no longer her greatest threat. He might just be her only hope. The rules of the game had just been erased, and the board had been set on fire. The world had shrunk to the size of a single, insurmountable problem: Luca Moretti. Nora knew, with the chilling certainty of a death sentence, that they could not fight him alone. Her father's network was old and frayed, and Damien's silent financial warfare had already crippled them. There was only one move left to make a move that felt like swallowing poison to cure a disease. She used the burner phone one last time. When Damien answered, his silence was a wall of ice. "He's a threat to both of us," Nora said, her voice devoid of pleading, stripped down to pure pragmatic fact. "Your revenge on my family won't mean much if Luca Moretti burns this city to the ground. We need to talk." She expected him to refuse, to mock her, to hang up. Instead, a long pause stretched across the line before he spoke, his voice cold and clipped. "The Chicago Cultural Center, Preston Bradley Hall, midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. At midnight, Nora stood beneath the vast, breathtaking Tiffany dome. The immense, silent hall, usually filled with tourists and the echoes of music, was empty and hauntingly quiet. The intricate glass mosaics shimmered above her, a silent audience to the grim meeting about to take place. He was already there, standing in the shadows on the far side of the room. He stepped into the light, and Nora's breath caught. He was no longer just her enemy. He was a potential and terrifying ally. "This is a desperate move," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Even for you, this isn't about desperation. It's about survival," Nora countered, stepping forward, refusing to let him control the space. "Luca Moretti doesn't operate with scalpels like you do, Damien. He uses sledgehammers and bombs. He'll tear down your pristine corporate empire just as fast as he'll burn down my father's bar. In his eyes, we are both just weeds in his ancestral garden, and he has come to pull us out by the roots." Damien's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. He knew she was right. "Why should I work with the daughter of the man who stood by and did nothing?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "Your family's weakness created this problem." "My family's history created this problem," she corrected, her voice sharp. "And that history is something you don't have. My father knows the old ways. He knows the names, the places, the forgotten loyalties that a man like Moretti will try to exploit. He knows how the old ghosts think. You don't." She had him. The one piece of the puzzle he couldn't obtain with all his money and technology was the institutional memory of the world his father had died in. "And you?" Damien challenged. "You have your father's memories. What do I have?" "You have everything else," Nora admitted. "Surveillance, resources, manpower. You can see Moretti coming in ways we can only guess at. Separately, we are vulnerable. He will crush my family with brute force, and he will bleed your syndicate with 1,000 small, chaotic attacks that your corporate structure isn't built to handle. Together, we might have a chance." The cold, hard logic of it settled between them. It was a truth neither of them wanted, but one neither could deny. Damien was silent for a long moment, the strategist in him warring with the Avenger. Finally, he gave a curt, decisive nod. "An alliance, then," he stated. It was not a question. "But there are terms. We share all intelligence. We coordinate our defenses. All communication goes through me. But do not mistake this for forgiveness." His eyes bored into hers, cold and merciless. "My war with your father is not over. It is merely postponed." "Fine," Nora agreed, her heart a block of ice in her chest. "We can go back to trying to destroy each other after we've managed to stay alive. An unholy alliance, forged in a cathedral of art, built on a foundation of mutual hatred and shared desperation." As they stood there, two lonely monarchs mapping out a war, Nora saw past the ghost for a moment. She saw the same fierce, protective instinct he held for his empire that she held for her family. He was a dark mirror of herself. They finalized the logistics in clipped, impersonal tones, two generals planning a campaign. Then, it was over. "I'll be in touch," he said, a dismissal. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor before he was swallowed by the shadows. Nora stayed for a moment, the weight of the devil's bargain she had just struck pressing down on her. She had allied herself with the man who wanted to ruin her family in order to fight the man who wanted to kill them. She was no longer just a speakeasy owner's daughter. She was a player, a queen in a deadly game, and her most powerful piece was the one she trusted the least. The heart of the Onyx Syndicate was not a smoky backroom, but a silent, refrigerated command center hidden deep within a downtown skyscraper. Gleaming screens covered every wall, displaying a river of data surveillance feeds, financial trackers, and a real-time map of Chicago's underworld. It was the world of the ghost, a place of cold, hard information, and Nora felt like a foreign body in its sterile, humming veins. Damien stood before the central screen, a dark silhouette against the glow. "Luca Moretti is old school," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "He's arrogant. He's holding a high-stakes poker game tonight at the Elysian Hotel. It's not about the money. It's a recruitment drive. He's testing the loyalty and nerve of the city's key players." "You want to crash the party," Nora stated, understanding immediately. "I can't," Damien corrected, turning to face her. "My face is too well known in that world, as is my enmity with the Moretti family. But you," his eyes scanned her, a cold, calculating appraisal. "You are the disgruntled daughter of a washed-up bootlegger. Your family is weak, financially crippled. It's the perfect cover story. You're looking for a new alliance. You'll offer him information, low-level routes, contacts, things we can afford to sacrifice in exchange for a seat at his table." "And what do I get out of this suicide mission?" Nora asked, crossing her arms. Damien tapped a small, flesh-colored object on the console in front of him. "An earpiece. You get me. I will be your eye in the sky. Our team has a camera in the suite. I'll see every card, every tell. I will walk you through every bet, every conversation. You will be my puppet, and I will be the voice in your ear." The intimacy of the proposal was as terrifying as the danger itself. To place her life so completely in the hands of her enemy was the ultimate gamble, but it was the only move they had. 2 hours later, Nora was transformed. She wore a backless, sapphire blue gown, her hair styled in elegant waves. She looked every inch the reckless heiress ready to burn her family's legacy to the ground. As she entered the heavily guarded hotel suite, the earpiece felt like a hot coal against her skin. The room was thick with cigar smoke, the scent of expensive cologne, and the low, dangerous murmur of powerful men. At the center of it all sat Luca Moretti, laughing, a predator holding court. "He's watching you," Damien's voice whispered in her ear, a ghost only she could hear. "Don't look at him yet. Go to the bar. Order a Sazerac. Project Confidence." She followed his instructions, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the next hour, she played her part, guided by Damien's unseen hand. He told her which conversations to join, which men to flatter, which to ignore. When she finally took her seat at the poker table, the buy-in a stack of chips that represented more money than she had ever seen, the real performance began. Luca Moretti was charming, his smile brilliant, his eyes as dead and black as a shark's. "Nora Hayes," he said, his voice a silky purr. "I heard your father's empire was crumbling. I'm surprised you can afford a seat at this table." "Don't flinch," Damien's voice coached. "Smile. Be bold." "I'm financing my future," Nora replied coolly, meeting Moretti's gaze. "The past is a sinking ship. I'm looking for a stronger vessel." The game was a masterclass in tension. Nora played hand after hand, guided by Damien's cool, precise instructions. He read the table with inhuman skill, seeing bluffs, predicting plays, turning her into a formidable player. The most terrifying moment came when she was dealt a mediocre hand. "All in," Damien said in her ear. Nora's blood ran cold. "He's insane," she thought. "Trust me, Nora. The man across from you is overconfident. Moretti is using this hand to see if you'll break. He doesn't respect caution. Show him you're reckless. Push all your chips in. Now." Her hand trembling almost imperceptibly, Nora pushed the mountain of chips into the center of the table. The room went silent. Luca Moretti watched her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. After a long, agonizing minute, the other player folded. Nora won a massive pot on a pure, cold-blooded bluff orchestrated by the man trying to destroy her family. Later, during a break in the game, she cornered Moretti's top lieutenant, a brutish man named Franco. As Damien fed her lines, she offered him a piece of valuable information, and in the process, expertly attached a microscopic listening device to the inside of his jacket collar, a move she and Damien had rehearsed for an hour. She played for another 30 minutes, then cashed out, feigning a bored indifference she did not feel. Walking out of that suite was like surfacing from underwater. Back in the sterile chill of the command center, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving them both raw and exhausted. They stood side by side, watching the audio feed from the bug she had planted come to life on the screen. Damien turned to her, his face unreadable in the glow of the monitors. The professional distance was gone, shattered by the shared high-wire tension of the night. "You were," he started, then stopped, as if the words were foreign to him. Convincing. It was the closest he would ever come to a compliment, or perhaps an apology for putting her through it. Nora looked at him, at the man whose voice had been her sole lifeline in a room full of killers, and saw not the ghost, but her unwilling partner. The invisible thread of their alliance, forged in desperation, had just been tempered in fire, and the heat that now radiated between them had nothing to do with their war and everything to do with their own. For 2 days, the listening device Nora had planted was a fountain of low-level intelligence. Damien's command center became a second home for her, the two of them working in a state of tense, professional truce. They listened for hours to the mundane brutalities of Luca Moretti's operation, a world of threats and extortion, and then they hit gold. Franco, Moretti's lieutenant, was recorded confirming the details of a major summit. Moretti was gathering the heads of the city's independent factions at an old, abandoned meatpacking warehouse by the canal, a place reeking of old blood and decay. He was going to demand they bend the knee or be broken. "This is it," Damien said, his eyes gleaming with cold, strategic light. "This is our chance to cut the head off the snake before it can rally an army." His plan was not a bloody assault. It was an act of public humiliation. His elite tactical team would infiltrate the warehouse mid-meeting, not with guns blazing, but with cameras. They would stream the feed directly to the phones of every significant player in the city's underworld, exposing Moretti's power play, shattering his mystique, and turning his potential allies against him. Nora's role was unexpectedly crucial. When she told her father the location, a look of grim recognition crossed his face. He disappeared into his office and returned with a set of old, rolled-up blueprints. "The slaughterhouse," Finn said, his finger tracing a path on the dusty paper. "My father used to move product through there in the 60s. It's a maze, but there's a network of old service tunnels underneath. They aren't on any modern city plan." He had just given them the key. A way in, completely undetected. For the first time, Nora felt a surge of cautious optimism. Their alliance, this strange marriage of old-world knowledge and new-world technology, was working. In the dimly lit bar of the Gilded Cage, Leo the bartender wiped down the clean counter, his hands shaking. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced around the empty room before answering, his voice a choked whisper. "He knows about the meeting," Leo said, his eyes darting toward the door. "They're using the old service tunnels, the ones by the canal." He listened for a moment, his face pale with terror. You promised you wouldn't hurt her. Please." The line went dead. Leo leaned against the counter, his eyes squeezed shut, a single tear tracing a path down his rugged cheek. In the command center, the tension was a palpable thing. On the main screen, a multi-panel display showed the live helmet cam feeds from Damien's 6-man team as they moved silently through the dark, dripping service tunnels beneath the slaughterhouse. Nora and Damien stood side by side, watching, their faces illuminated by the ghostly green glow. "They're approaching the entry point beneath the main processing floor," Damien murmured, his voice a low, controlled hum. 2 minutes until they're in position. The plan was unfolding perfectly. The team reached a ladder, climbing one by one into the cavernous, dark space of the warehouse. The feeds showed rusted hooks hanging from the ceiling like a metal forest. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. "Hold," the team leader whispered over the comms. "Something's not right." Suddenly, the entire warehouse was flooded with blinding industrial lights. The helmet cams swiveled wildly, revealing dozens of men armed with automatic weapons, emerging from behind pillars and machinery. Luca Moretti stood on a raised gantry above them, a wide, triumphant smile on his face. It was a perfectly executed ambush. "Ambush! Ambush!" the team leader's voice screamed over the comms. Then, the world erupted into a storm of gunfire. The audio feed became a chaotic roar of shouting and automatic weapon fire. On the screen, the camera feeds went haywire, a blur of motion, a flash of a muzzle, a sickening lurch as a man went down. One by one, the panels went black. Feed lost. Feed lost. Feed lost. Within 10 seconds, all 6 panels were dead. A profound, horrifying silence filled the command center. Nora stared at the black screens, her hands covering her mouth, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. Damien stood completely still, his body rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He didn't rage. He didn't yell. A terrifying cold fury settled over his face, more frightening than any outburst. Their plan, their team, their advantage, all of it was gone, annihilated. The information about the tunnels had come from her father. The leak had to have come from her side, from her world. She felt a wave of guilt so profound it was nauseating. She had led his men into a slaughterhouse. They stood in the silent, tomb-like room, the dead screens reflecting their stricken faces. The fragile trust they had built was gone, replaced by the sickening realization that their alliance had been compromised from the inside. There was a snake in their garden, and it had just delivered a fatal bite. The silence in the command center was a living entity, thick with grief and the static of dead channels. 6 black screens stood as tombstones for Damien's men. He hadn't moved a muscle, his stillness more terrifying than any explosion of rage. When he finally turned to face Nora, his eyes were not the stormy gray she knew. They were the flat, dead gray of ash. "The tunnels," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "The information came from your father. No one outside of this room and your circle knew those plans." He took a step closer, his presence a suffocating wave of cold fury. "It seems your family's loyalty is just as worthless today as it was 30 years ago." The accusation, though expected, hit Nora like a physical blow. Guilt and horror warred within her. "It wasn't my father," she whispered, the words tasting like a lie even to her own ears. The leak came from her side. The shame of it was a lead weight in her stomach. Her mind raced through the impossibly short list of people who knew: Finn, herself, and Leo. Leo, the kind, loyal bartender who had known her since she was a child. The realization was a fresh, sickening wave of betrayal. Before she could voice the name, a new alert chimed through the command center, a jarring intrusion into their private hell. A single, encrypted video file was being pushed through their firewalls. A direct message. Damien's jaw tightened. He strode to the console and played the file. Luca Moretti's handsome, smiling face filled the screen. He was in the slaughterhouse, the scene of the ambush, bodies of Damien's men visible but blurred in the background. Luca held up a silver dog tag to the camera. "Thorne," he began, his voice dripping with theatrical pity. "I've heard so many stories about you. The ghost, a whisper in the shadows. But your ghosts can bleed." He tossed the dog tag aside. "I'm tired of playing with your puppets. I want the man himself. Union Station, the Great Hall, tomorrow at noon." He smiled, a flash of white teeth. "I have something of your father's, a little memento I recovered. Come and claim it." The video ended. It was a trap, a blatant, arrogant, and irresistible trap. "I'm going," Damien said, his voice a low growl. The strategist was gone, replaced by a man consumed by the primal need for vengeance. "Don't be a fool, Damien," Nora cried, grabbing his arm. "That's exactly what he wants. He's expecting you. He'll have the entire place lined with men. It's a suicide mission." "Those were my men," he snarled, pulling his arm away from her touch. "This is my fight, my debt to pay." She saw it then, the same reckless, all-consuming grief that had driven him for 30 years was now blinding him completely. And she realized with a sickening lurch that she was the only one who could stop him from walking to his own execution. "Then send me," she said, the words tumbling out of her, born of desperation and a frantic need to atone. He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Absolutely not. He is expecting the ghost," she pressed, her voice gaining strength, her logic a lifeline in the emotional storm. "He is expecting a tactical assault. He won't be expecting me, the broken daughter of his new, crippled enemy, coming to beg for a place. I can get close to him, Damien. I can be the one thing he can't predict. Let me be your distraction, your Trojan horse. I don't trade one liability for another," he bit out, his words laced with cruelty, but his eyes betrayed a different emotion, a flicker of sheer terror at the thought of her walking into that room. "And I won't stand here and watch you die because you're too blinded by rage to see the smarter move," she yelled back, her fear for him overriding everything else. "This isn't about your pride, it's about winning." Their furious, desperate argument echoed in the tomb-like room. It wasn't a debate over strategy anymore. It was a raw, personal battle, his guilt-ridden, protective fury against her guilt-ridden, desperate logic. And her logic was undeniable. He knew it. He hated it. He hated her for being right. He finally turned away from her, slamming his fist down on the console. "Fine," he bit out, the word torn from him. "Fine." The new plan, deadlier and more desperate than the last, was set. An hour later, Nora was ready. As she stood by the door, Damien approached her. He said nothing, simply pushed a small, flat button into her hand. A panic button. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, electric touch. "The moment you are in place, my remaining teams will move on Moretti's other assets," he said, his voice all business once more, but his eyes were a vortex of conflict. He met her gaze, and the mask of the ghost was gone. "Do not get yourself killed, Nora." It was a command, but it sounded like a plea. She gave him a single, sharp nod and walked out the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The trap had been sprung on them. Now, she was walking back into its jaws. The Great Hall of Union Station was a cathedral of journeys, its vast, vaulted ceilings echoing with the announcements of departures and arrivals. Sunlight streamed through the grand, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. To the hundreds of travelers rushing to their gates, it was just another day. To Nora, it felt like the end of the world. She spotted Luca Moretti holding court at a cafe near the grand staircase. His men spread out at the surrounding tables, a web of casual menace. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Nora began the long walk across the marble floor, each step an act of will. She played her part to perfection, her expression a mask of pale desperation. "Mr. Moretti," she began, her voice trembling just enough. "My father is finished. Damien Thorne has ruined him. I have nowhere else to go. I'll tell you everything." Luca leaned back, savoring her apparent surrender like a fine wine. "My dear Nora," he said, his smile a predatory slash. "I do love a good story, but I'm afraid I've already heard this one." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men dragged a beaten, slump-shouldered figure from a back room. It was Leo. Nora's heart stopped. Luca's smile widened. "Your bartender was very talkative," he purred, "especially after we sent his wife a photo of their lovely daughter at her preschool. He told us all about your clever little alliance. This trap was never for Thorne, it was for you." Her blood ran cold. Her cover, her plan, her entire world gone. She was a hostage. Luca pulled out a phone and dialed. A moment later, a voice came through the speaker, Damien's, cold and controlled. "What is this?" "Thorne. A pleasure to finally speak to you," Luca said, his voice booming with triumph. "I have a present for you. A traitor and a pretty liar." He gestured, and one of his men yanked Nora to her feet, pressing the cold, hard barrel of a gun to her temple. "And I have something else," Luca continued, placing a small, worn leather journal on the table. "Your father's, his private ledger. Every deal, every partner, every secret that built his legacy. The blueprint to the life you should have had." Damien was silent, but Nora could imagine him in his command center, watching this unfold on a grainy security feed, his world narrowing to this single, impossible moment. "So here it is, Ghost," Luca announced to the entire cafe. "The devil's choice. You can have the journal that represents your past, the very reason for your pathetic crusade. Or you can have the girl, who represents your future, however brief it may be. My men are everywhere. You make a move, she dies. You walk away. I leave the journal. Your father's soul, or hers. You have 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Nora stared desperately around the station, her eyes finding a public transit camera mounted high on a pillar. She knew he was watching. She looked directly into the lens and gave the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't do it. It's not worth it." His voice, when it came over the speaker, was as cold and calm as a winter grave. "The deal is off." Luca's smile was triumphant. Nora's heart shattered. He had chosen the past. "Because you've made a fatal miscalculation, Luca," Damien's voice continued, the tone shifting, hardening into something lethal. "My teams aren't targeting your assets. They're targeting your family. They're at your mother's penthouse in Lincoln Park. They're at your cousin's law firm. And they're with a team of international bankers who are, as we speak, seizing the Cayman Island accounts your father spent his life building. I'm not here to stop your new empire. I'm here to erase your old one." Stunned disbelief washed over Luca Moretti's face, his arrogant smirk melting into a mask of pure fury. In that single, critical moment of distraction, chaos erupted. Nora slammed her heel down on Luca's instep and jammed the panic button in her palm. A high-frequency shriek filled the air, causing the men closest to her to flinch in pain. She ripped herself free from her captor's grasp as the first gunshot echoed through the great hall. Travelers screamed, diving behind benches and luggage. Men in plain clothes, Damien's people, rose from the crowd, guns drawn, converging on Moretti's stunned crew. A full-blown firefight had broken out in the middle of Union Station. Nora ran, adrenaline coursing through her veins, her lungs burning. She sprinted for the exit Damien had designated, not looking back. He had made his choice. He hadn't chosen his revenge. He hadn't chosen his past. He had chosen her. And in doing so, he had just brought the entire underworld of Chicago crashing down upon them all. The safe house was an anonymous, high-end apartment in a building that prided itself on the privacy of its tenants. It was clean, impersonal, and, above all, quiet. The silence was a stark contrast to the echoing gunshots and screaming chaos of Union Station. Nora sat on a leather sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. the adrenaline of the firefight slowly seeping away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the tremors of shock. The door opened and Damien entered. He looked like a fallen angel, his impeccably tailored suit scuffed with dirt, a shallow cut bleeding freely on his cheekbone, and his eyes holding the weary, haunted look of a man who had just stared into the abyss. He had coordinated her extraction and the subsequent citywide chaos from a mobile command unit right in the heart of the storm. He said nothing, simply went to a pristine bar cart and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his hands steady. He handed one to her before sinking into the armchair opposite, the first sign of his own exhaustion showing in the slight slump of his shoulders. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the clinking of ice in their glasses. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. Nora had to ask. She had to understand. "The journal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your father's legacy. Your entire reason. Why?" Damien stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "For 30 years," he began, his voice low and raw, "I defined myself by what I had lost. I wasn't a man. I was a monument to a memory. I collected power, money, secrets, all of it just stones to build a tomb for my past." He finally lifted his head, and his gaze met hers. The ghost was gone. In his place was just a man. "My father's legacy wasn't in that journal, Nora. It was the son he never got to raise. It was the life I never got to live because I was too busy chasing his death." He leaned forward, his eyes full of a truth that was as painful as it was liberating. "I spent my life honoring the dead. You were the first person who made me want to be alive." The confession settled in the quiet room, a declaration that changed everything. He hadn't just chosen her over an object. He had chosen a future over the past. He had chosen life. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Later, after the storm in her heart had quieted, they dealt with the fallout. Luca Moretti had escaped in the chaos, but he was wounded, his power base shattered. Damien's surgical strike on his family's finances had been devastating, and the public nature of the shootout had made Moretti the city's most wanted man. He was no longer a king. He was a rabid dog on the run. Then there was the matter of Leo. Damien's men had picked him up. Nora spoke to him over a secure video link. She saw his bruised face, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was heartbreaking. He told her about the threats against his daughter, his voice choked with sobs. Nora listened, and the anger she expected to feel was replaced by a deep, aching sadness. She told Damien she didn't want revenge. Leo's betrayal had a price, but it would be one of exile, not blood. Finally, she called her father. The relief in Finn's voice when he heard she was safe was a raw, unguarded thing. The terror of the last few hours had seemingly washed away decades of old ghosts. For the first time, he sounded simply like a father, not a guardian of dark secrets. As the first, pale light of dawn began to streak the sky, Nora and Damien stood by the window, looking out over the wounded, sleeping city. The exhaustion between them was immense, but it was overlaid with a new, terrifyingly fragile intimacy. He had chosen her. She had trusted him. The war outside was not over, but the war between them was. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the cut on his cheek. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact before leaning into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment of peace. "What now?" she whispered, as the sun began to rise. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his expression one she had never seen before, not of a strategist, not of an avenger, but of a man on the edge of a new beginning. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Now," Damien said, his voice quiet but firm, "we stop being ghosts." The future was a terrifying unknown. Moretti was still out there. The law would be hunting them all. But as they stood together, watching the sun rise over the ashes of their old lives, they were no longer on opposite sides. They were simply a man and a woman, ready to face the dawn. 6 months later, the air didn't smell of rain and secrets, but of chicory coffee, sweet olive blossoms, and the humid, soulful promise of the Mississippi River. New Orleans was a city that didn't hide its ghosts. It danced with them, weaving them into the vibrant tapestry of its music and its nights. In the heart of the French Quarter, on a street where the notes of a lone saxophone could always be heard, was a small, thriving jazz club called The Lullaby. The name was a nod to a past Nora had left behind, a secret recipe transformed into an honest business. The club was her dream made real, a place of warm light, polished wood, and music that was pure, unadulterated soul. Tonight, she sat at the grand piano on the small stage, her fingers dancing across the keys, her own composition filling the emptying room. The melody was no longer a lament for a life she couldn't have. It was a complex, soaring piece, full of the discordant notes of a painful past resolving into a hopeful, passionate harmony. She didn't have to look to know he was there. He always was. Damien Thorne stood leaning against the back wall, a silent guardian in a perfectly cut suit. He was no longer the ghost. The shadows he commanded now were those of a legitimate global security empire, the most illicit parts of the Onyx Syndicate having been surgically excised and dismantled. He was still the most dangerous man in any room, but his dangerous energy was now a shield, coiled protectively around this small club and the woman at its heart. The last of their enemies were gone. Luca Moretti, in a final desperate act of chaotic violence, had been cornered by the FBI in Miami and had gone down in a blaze of gunfire, a victim of the same brutal world he sought to rule. Her father, Finn, had finally sold the Gilded Cage, using the profits to retire to the quiet coast of Ireland, at peace for the first time in his life. The past was not forgotten, but it had been laid to rest. As Nora played the final, lingering chord, the smattering of remaining applause was led by one pair of hands. Damien made his way to the stage as the last patrons drifted out into the lively New Orleans night. He didn't speak, just stood by the piano, his hand resting gently on the polished wood. The faint scar above his eye from the night of the ambush was a permanent reminder of the price they had paid. "That's a new one," he said, his voice a low rumble that was now more familiar to her than her own heartbeat. "I call it The Dawn," she replied, her fingers still resting on the cool ivory. "It's about what comes after the ashes." He looked around the room, at the warm glow, the happy, lingering ghosts of the night's music. "My father," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He once told my mother he wanted to open a place just like this. A small, honest place with real music. We built it, Damien," Nora whispered, looking up at him. "We built it for them. For all of them." He reached out, his touch impossibly gentle, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His thumb brushed the side of her face, and in that simple, quiet gesture was the entire story of their impossible journey. The lies, the threats, the betrayal, the fear, all of it had led them here, to this moment of hard-won peace. "I spent my entire life believing my name was a curse," he said, his gray eyes holding hers, no longer stormy, but clear and deep, a debt of blood that could only be paid with more blood. "You taught me it was just a name, and it was mine to redefine." Nora lifted her hand to his, covering it with her own. "We redefined it together." He leaned down, and his lips met hers. The kiss held none of the punishing fury of their first encounter in the alley. There was no desperation, no conflict. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of deep and abiding love. It was the kiss of two survivors who had walked through fire and found not an end, but a beginning. It was the final, perfect note of a new symphony, their own, rising from the ashes, promising a lifetime of music yet to come.